Hey there, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this week's episode. Last week we were out in the field checking out a couple of New Hampshire locations for wild animals. We unfortunately didn't get any bears or moose as we talked about last week, but we did get some great birds, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So if you haven't watched last week's episode, I would encourage you to go back and take a look so that this week's episode has a bit of context. Now, before we begin any of our processing here in primarily Lightroom, I want to offer three big themes that you're going to hear kind of over and over during this episode. One of which is that your processing actually begins before you ever leave the house to actually go create the images that you create out in the field, right? It's in your planning, it's in your preparation, it's in the settings you have in your camera, so that when you are out in the field, you're collecting all of the correct information in order to come back into the office in either Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever processing software you use. You're able to create and extract the image that you saw out in the field and you want to portray in your final image. So this means understanding kind of where the light is, understanding the behaviors of the birds. Now, we can't control all of that, so we do have to be ready to kind of go on a moment's notice, if you will. But at the same time, the more we can plan for prior to the shot, the easier our processing will be back in the studio afterwards. So that's number one. Number two, I find that my best post-processing occurs when I tend to apply a little lighter touch to the post-processing. So in Lightroom, it's those sliders. I try to not move those sliders a whole lot. Sometimes I have to, but in most cases, I try not to. Now, part of that is because I've done my work out in the field and I've come back with an image that is pretty darn close to being done, or as much as possible, so that I don't have to apply a whole bunch of changes in Lightroom. Now, sometimes that's not the case, but I find that my best images come when I actually have a light touch on the image themselves. And then finally, and this is probably the most important thing, and that is that ultimately what you're doing in post-processing is you are executing your vision, not the vision of the Instagrammer who you think wants to see your picture. As soon as you start making pictures and creating images for Instagram, I think you're beginning a losing battle. Create the image that you want to create. Create the image that tells the story that you want to be told. You are the creator of this image, and you are the shaper of that story. So it's really up to you to create the image that tells that story. Don't let social media or expectations that may or may not be out there push your processing in one direction or the other. You post-process for yourself. You create the image that you want to create to tell the story you want to tell. And if people like it, okay. If they don't, that's okay too. The most important thing is that you create the image that you like and that you want to share out in the world. All right, so those are my three things. We begin our processing in the field. Generally speaking, I find a lighter touch in processing results in better images. And thirdly, and most importantly, you create the image that you want to create, the one that you think tells the story the best. So with all that said, why don't we jump into Lightroom and get going with our work? All right, so now that we're in Lightroom, we're going to take a look at four images. We're going to take a look at the eagle that landed and harassed the heron and egret over in Copp's Pond. We're going to take a look at both the merlin and the kestrel from Sandwich. They were both hunting insects, dragonflies, presumably. And then we want to take a look at the northern harrier, which we saw hunting up in Coos County. Each of those have a little bit of a different story, and I'm going to be able to use kind of the tools a little bit differently, but you're going to see a general kind of similar processing that I'm going to do with each of those. And the reason is because I don't want to spend a lot of time in the processing process. I want to be out in the field. So I've really kind of created a process that I think is pretty simple and pretty easy to kind of replicate all the time. Now, in doing so, I'm going to use three different software. I'm going to use Lightroom primarily. You're going to see that I'm going to use Topaz. It's going to help me deal with noise and make sure it's super sharp. And then the third is Photoshop. And I'm going to use Photoshop sometimes at the end to eliminate some distractions. And I'll talk about that when we get there. All right. So let's begin the process here of working on these images in Lightroom. All right, well, let's get started by taking a look at the image of the eagle that I was able to take while at Copp's Pond last week. Now, you might remember the eagle never really came very close. It was way out in the middle of the pond. That means I got a couple of things working against me here. Number one, it's really far away. And number two, as the sun began to hit the pond, we began to get some water vapor or some haze coming off of the water. So I don't have a super sharp image of this eagle, but I do want to use this to talk a little bit about Topaz AI, show you how I use Topaz AI, and then we will, I'll stop at that point. We'll move on to some of the other images. So let's go ahead into Lightroom and take a look. So as I was saying, again, the eagle is really far away. Here I am at 600 millimeters. Even though I'm wide open in my aperture, I take a close look at this guy. He's not really super sharp. We've got some haze, as I mentioned earlier, heat haze coming off and water vapor coming off the pond. And he's just really, really far away. And so it's just super hard to get a really crisp shot from that far away, especially as that water heats up and we start getting water vapor into the air. That being said, let's take it over into Topaz, which I've already done. And one of the things that we can begin to take a look at is, okay, let's go ahead and run the denoise and let's run the sharpen. Now, you're going to take a look at this and say, boy, that doesn't really look that good. And it doesn't. It doesn't look all that great. It looks better. And let's go ahead and just see if it can identify the subject, which it does. You can see it's kind of in red there. And so it's a little bit crisper. It's a little bit more clear. If I were to zoom in on that eagle, it's a little, ooh, that's not good. It's going to be a little bit more crisp and a little bit clearer than it was before. If I bring this line across, you can see it's just really soft over there. You bring it over here, it's just a little bit sharper. It's never, ever going to be an image that I can zoom way in, as you just saw when I tried to zoom in a second ago. Okay, that's not going to work. But it does clear up and sort of make the image a bit more crisp than it was before. And so here's what we're going to do. Oh, let's actually denoise not just the subject. Let's denoise all. And now it's going to denoise the entire image. And then we're going to export that into Lightroom. And that's coming over into Lightroom. It'll be over here momentarily as it saves. It brings it back over here as a DNG file. So it's still a raw file. And if I go ahead and zoom in on it, you can see it's a little bit crisper, but it's still, again, not going to be an image that I'm going to be able to make into a portrait of this eagle. Instead, this is very much going to be an environmental portrait, and that is going to take some working. So even when you have great equipment and seemingly great conditions, it doesn't necessarily always result in a great image. And while Topaz can do wonders, it's not going to take an image that is blurry or way too soft. It's just not going to make it into the image that perhaps you want it to make it into. So all of these tools that I'm talking about today do have some limitations. That being said, the next three images that we're going to work on should work out just fine between Topaz, Lightroom, and a little bit of Photoshop as well. So why don't we go ahead and we'll take a look at the Merlin, which is next. We'll go from there. So after leaving Copp's wildlife management area and photographing the eagle, we went to Sandwich to the Thompson Wildlife Refuge, and we were able to spot pretty quickly a Merlin that was feeding on insects. And I was able to grab an image of him sitting in the tree after eating one of these insects just before he went flying off into the distance. So let's go ahead and take a look at that image now. Now, as you can see in the image, we're in a little bit better shape here in terms of not only how close I was to it, but also heat haze. So I was closer to this Merlin than I was to the eagle. And because he was higher up and the temperature had sort of settled in because the sun had been up for a little while, it wasn't creating heat haze off the ground. So I didn't have the heat haze that I had with my eagle before. And in fact, if I go ahead and zoom in on this Merlin, you can see right away that he is much sharper than the eagle was before. Now, just because he's super sharp doesn't mean I'm not going to go ahead and begin my process with Topaz. And so we're going to go ahead and do that again. We're going to go to plug-in extras and go and hit Topaz. We're going to edit a copy so we keep the original file, as I talked about earlier. And then this, again, once I'm done, we're going to bring this back as a DNG file. And so we'll still have all of the ability to do what we need to do earlier. Now, Topaz has run its AI and it has decided that we don't need to denoise. I am still going to denoise it just a bit, even though I was shooting at a relatively low ISO. It's not going to hurt it at all. And so we're going to run denoise. And you can see that between sharpen and denoise, as they run these again here, we have a pretty sharp and clean, crisp image of our Merlin. So now we can bring this back. So now that we have a clean, crisp, sharp image of our Merlin, we're going to bring this back in as a DNG file. And we're going to be able to process it as we would, as if it was just out of camera. So let's bring that back into Lightroom, and Lightroom will reopen up here in just a second. Okay, and so here is our new file. You can see that we have that clean, crisp look that we wanted, right? So now we're going to start processing. So the first thing I always do is I go ahead and I zoom in, or I crop in, on the image that I am going to work with, or that I think I'm going to have as my final image. So let's just start here. And we're going to work, this is the image we want to work with, okay? So here is my workflow. It's almost always the same. First, I really like to use Adobe Landscape for all of my images as a profile. It keeps it consistent, but also has a little bit of a warmer tone to the whole image as a result. And then as far as my white balance is concerned, I'm going to start with auto. Then I'll work my way to daylight. And then I'll work my way to cloudy, and I'll decide, okay, which one do I like the best? I actually like the way cloudy looks right now. Daylight looks just a little bit too blue. Auto looks a little bit too warm. And so cloudy seems to be nice and in between. And I'll fine tune this here in just a little bit. At this point, I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. I like to add contrast early in the image when Topaz does its work and it denoises, it tends to soften everything. So I'll add a little bit of contrast back in. I'm also going to add a little bit of vibrance and just a touch of saturation. And this is mostly just because, as you know, a raw file is going to come out. It's a little bit desaturated. And so I want to give it a little bit of a punch when it comes back over. And so this is the image that we're going to start with, or begin to work with here. And then I'm going to come into my tone curve, and I'm going to play with my tone curve just a little bit, but not a lot. I just want to kind of see overall what happens if I work with it. But not surprising, I don't have a lot here that I want to do because it's really kind of well exposed, and I'm going to be able to make some changes more locally here in just a second, which is what I'll do now. I'm going to come into my masks, and I am going to, first, we're going to work on the object or the subject itself. Now, I have a tendency to choose the objects, and I will decide, okay, these are my objects. I find that when I do the object, it just tends to define the object better than if I said the subject alone. So let's go ahead and identify my object. And again, the nice thing here is I don't need to show the whole thing. All I need to show is just a little bit, and it gets the entire bird. It did not get the entire stick. So we're going to add, and we can just add by doing another object, and that should get the rest of the stick there. And then we're going to add, let's add by doing another object. We'll get the rest of the stick over here. And now if I show my overlay, I really kind of have, it didn't get that. Okay, so what I can do at this point then is I can grab my brushes, and I can go ahead and brush in. Let's go ahead and increase the flow. I can go ahead and brush in the rest of this branch here and over here. All right. I tend to include not only the bird, but also the branch that it's perched on, so it doesn't look like it's on a, depending on what I do here, whether I warm it up, cool it off, whatever, it all kind of happens uniformly here. All right, let's go ahead and turn the overlay off here because we know what we're working with. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to open up my shadows just a touch, not a lot. And I often will give it a little bit of exposure and a little bit of warmth. I like to have my object being a little bit warmer. And you'll see in just a moment how that comes into play. And then I'm going to come over into my texture, and I'm going to add a little bit of texture that adds a little bit of sharpness to the bird and to this object that it's on. It is a little bit hot in terms of the highlights, so let's pull the highlights back some. Let's pull the whites back some, and I feel like that's in a little bit of a better place. Okay, so now we've worked on the bird and the stick that it's sitting on. And so we're going to duplicate and invert the mask. And this is going to allow us, if I show the overlay, it's going to allow us to work on everything else in the image. Now, don't worry about down here, because I'm going to get rid of that later. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn that overlay off. And I'm going to just reduce the exposure a little bit. And I'm going to cool it off some. That might be too much right now, but you'll see what we're going to do here in a little bit. So don't worry too much about that at this point. So now what I've done is created a little bit of contrast between the object and its background, both by warming the object and cooling the background, and then by giving a little bit of exposure to the object and dropping the exposure on the background. Now, the problem with this, or I should say the concern with this, could be to create something that looks like it's glowing, right? If I were to really pull this exposure down, now we have a glowing bird, and that's not what we want. So this is, I kind of talked about this earlier, right? This is where we want to have a gentle touch on our sliders. We don't want to create a situation where we have a glowing or nuclear bird, if you will. But it's still a little bit too contrasty, right? We have this kind of warm bird and cool background. And so we're gonna make that a bit more delicate here by adding another mask. We're going to use our radial gradient. Now, the radial gradient is my favorite mask because it is the one that we can be the most aggressive with, and it does the least amount of harm, if you will, to the image by being aggressive. And so, as you can see, we have a nice big radial gradient with a lot of feathering. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to warm it up, and I'm going to, I'm going to add a little bit of exposure. It might be a little bit too much, but we're going to look at that. And then we're going to add a little bit of warmth. And let me go ahead and open this up just a little bit more, right? And so this is a really subtle touch here. And if I turn this mask off, you're going to see what that subtle touch is. All we've done is sort of warmed up the center, and we have added a little bit of exposure to the center of the image, of course, with the bird in it. I call this celebration light. We're celebrating the bird, and in doing so, we are also kind of reducing the contrast between the bird, the object, and its background. We're creating a little bit more of a subtle flow from warm to cool as we move away from the bird by adding this radial gradient in on the bird. Oftentimes, then, I will duplicate and invert this mask. And I will go ahead and just pull back some of the exposure on the edges. And that creates a little bit of so that's going to create a little bit of a vignette for us, right? And so that will allow us to kind of darken those corners, keep the eyes moving in towards the bird. Okay? So that's pretty much what we're going to do. Now, sometimes I'll come back here, and this gives me a chance maybe to play with the overall exposure again. So I can brighten because at this point now, I have a nice ratio between my object and its background. And so I can play with the overall exposure and say, you know what, I want the whole thing to be just a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, depending on what my scene is, right? So I can be a little bit more dramatic this way, or I can be a little bit more airy and light if I move the exposure that way. So in this case, maybe a little bit more dramatic is fun. Now, before I do anything else, I think I do want to work on the crop, and I think I will use the rule of thirds here. We're going to really employ that. We want the bird looking across the image. It also kind of eliminated most of the sticks over on the right-hand side, and then it reduced what we have down below as well. And overall here, I think we have a pretty decent image and real nice image of our Merlin when it's all said and done. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this photo, and I'm going to edit it as a smart object over in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and turn the extras off. We're going to add a layer so we are non-destructive with our work here. And you'll notice up here that we have the remove tool. I'm just going to come down here and I'm going to remove these leaves, the top of these leaves. Let's go ahead and allow that to do that. We'll go ahead and we'll remove that. That's gone now. And if when we wanted to get crazy, I suppose we could go ahead and remove that stick as well. You don't have to, but just saying with this remove tool, you can kind of take what you want out of the image if you think it's appropriate. That was a little bit clunky. So let's just do that one more time and see what that looks like. All right, so you can decide it. And I think the question always is, where do I stop removing? Like, what is appropriate to remove, what is not? Now, if you're entering a photo contest, what I just did may not be allowed. And so you want to be aware of that. But if you are creating an image to share for yourself, then, by all means, do what you think is appropriate. All right. And there's our final image of our Merlin. So we're going to take a look at the Harrier now. And if you remember, the Harrier was photographed up in Coos County. This was actually a big surprise. I didn't expect to see a Harrier on the day, but we did. And if you remember, it's a very acrobatic apex predator, flies low to the ground, has a tendency to change directions very quickly, dive down for moles and mice and other things. We actually did see it successfully hunt, although it was really too far away for me to get an image. We got some video of it, but it hunted something along the shoreline, maybe a frog or a fish or something. I couldn't really tell, it was too far away. Nonetheless, we had a great time observing him and photographing him and whatnot. So we were able to get some images of him hunting. And so why don't we go ahead and move into Lightroom and take a look at those now. Now, I've already run this through Topaz, so we've already denoised it. We've already given it some sharpening. And if we take a look here, if we go into one of the images here, we're going to see that this is the one that's run through denoise. Over here on the left-hand side, you can see this is the original, and you can see there was quite a bit of noise in this image here just from the start. So running it through denoise really did us a world of good in terms of getting rid of the noise. It does end up with a bit of a clunky, like we can't zoom in too far on this guy because we were shooting at 6400 ISO. So even at 6400, we're going to run into some issues in terms of just really being able to get super sharp images. That being said, it's a lot better than it was. So let's go ahead and open the develop module, and we're going to work on our image that was run through Topaz. And as I always do, we're going to crop first. I like to see what I'm working with before I go ahead and begin processing. And just as I have with the other ones, we're going to go to Adobe Landscape. We're going to take a look at our white balance. And in this case here, I'm thinking that cloudy is best. I really kind of like the way that looked. It was either auto or cloudy, but I like I think I like auto. I like the overall warmth of auto just a little bit better. All right, we're going to add a little bit of contrast. We're going to add a little bit of vibrance and a little bit of saturation just to put a little bit of pop back in there, not a lot, but just enough to get a little bit more than we had before. And let's take a look at the tone curves. We're not going to do a whole lot here because I think we're going to do a lot more work in masking. I kind of like it when we lighten the entire image. That kind of looks good. We will pull the darks and the shadows down because they primarily impact behind our bird. All right, so now let's go into our masks. And the first thing we'll do is we will go ahead and identify our object, which of course is the Harrier. And you can see it does a really nice job of identifying the Harrier away from the trees in the background. And so we're going to warm this Harrier up a little bit. I'm not sure I'm going to add a lot of exposure to it. Maybe just a smidge, not a lot. I think I will pull down a little bit on the highlights because the area in its breast is a little bit hot. So let's go ahead and pull down on the highlights and the whites just a little bit. And then I'm going to come down here and I am going to add some texture and just a smidge of clarity just to give a little bit of that texture and grain back that we lost during the process of denoising it. Okay, so there's our mask of our object, the Harrier. Let's duplicate and invert that mask. And we're going to kind of do the opposite. We're going to darken the background. We will go ahead and close down some of the shadows. We're going to close down some of the darks and maybe cool off the background just a little bit. Now, one thing I want to be careful of here is as we've talked about, I don't want to create a sticker look here. I don't want the bird to be glowing or be nuclear in front of everything. That's not so bad, but this is where we're going to use our radial gradient. And we're going to make a nice big radial gradient around our bird and we'll even sort of mirror the contour of the bird there somewhat. And let's give it a little bit of exposure and a little bit of the warmth. And that is going to help to smooth out the flow from the warmer bird to the cooler background, from the lighter bird, the more exposed bird, to the darker background. So it doesn't look like a sticker sitting in front of the background there. Okay. And we're actually going to invert or duplicate and invert that mask. You can see now we're dealing with the outside of the bird in that mask primarily. And let's bring the exposure down just a smidge. And maybe we'll bring some of the blacks down and some of the shadows. And that, again, makes the bird pop just a little bit more out in front. Now, I'm a little bit, that does look like a sticker a little bit right now. Let's go ahead and add an overall to the overall exposure, maybe a little bit of warmth to the overall image. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into my radial gradient that I had earlier. And I'm going to pull this exposure back just a smidge, just so it's not popping too much. It doesn't look too much like a sticker on top of a green background. All right. But that's pretty much where we're going to land on this. I may add a little bit of dehaze. Sometimes that helps to kind of darken things up a little bit and create a little bit more contrast. But what I really like here is we ended up with an image where I think the bird looks natural. It doesn't look like it's glowing too much, or it doesn't look like it's glowing at all, really. I am going to pull back on the warmth here just a smidge like I did earlier. And I actually, in this case, might actually bring our exposure down on the bird some more. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay, now we end up with a bird, I think, that really looks like it's natural in the environment, yet it pops a little bit off of that background and really shows up in real time, right? So that's what we're doing with our northern harrier. Let's go ahead and take a look at our last one, which is the kestrel. All right, so for our final image, we're going to take a look at the kestrel that we saw the last morning that we were out. Now, this is going to be more of a landscape image that has a bird in it than a bird image that includes landscapes. And the reason is because the kestrel in this case is so small and so far away, but there is a story to be told. And so, yes, it is still a bird image. Yes, it's still a wildlife image, but we're going to think of it more about as a landscape image than we would have perhaps a bird image, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the image. Now, I've already run it through Topaz as I did in the last one, and you can see the difference between the two. Here is our non-Topaz as the original file, and you can see it's super noisy. At 4000 ISO, this is not a big surprise. If I come over here, you can see after I ran through Topaz, much cleaner image as a result, right? Now, there's our kestrel. It's a tiny little bird up on top of that tree, right? So we're not going to be able to isolate this and just take a picture of that or crop down into that. Plus, the story is that he's on this tree. That's what we want to tell here, okay? Now, what I do love about this image is that the tree has a lot of separation between it and the trees in the background. And using that 4.0 aperture on that lens is going to give us a great separation between the two. And so let's take advantage of that. So we're going to start by cropping, as I always do. So let's go ahead and crop down. We just really are focusing on our tree here. I love the colors down low in the image. I love the separation between the tree and the background. And I just love sort of all of the textures on this tree. And of course, we have our kestrel at the top. But this is more about the story of the tree with a kestrel than it is about a kestrel on a tree, if that makes any sense. So let's go ahead and Adobe Landscape. We're going to go ahead and check out our different white balances. There's auto, there's daylight, and there's cloudy. And I think probably, I think I'm going to go with auto. And let's start there and we'll see what happens after this. Okay. Let's add a touch of contrast, not a lot, a touch of vibrance and a touch of saturation just to give it a little pop. And we'll come into our tone curve as we've been doing. And I don't think we're going to see a whole lot here in the highlights or the lights. I will actually add a little bit of lights to it. And I will probably end up pulling the darks back. And see that creates even more separation between the tree and the background, which is kind of what I'm going for in this entire image. And the shadows is a little bit as well. Now, using our masks here is going to be a little bit difficult. So one of the things I could try is let's go ahead and mask the subject and let's see how it does. Now, you can see it actually has done a pretty good job of finding this tree in the center, but we have a lot of areas here that are kind of, it's a little bit messy, which is not surprising. So we can let's go ahead and use a brush and let's go ahead and subtract. We don't want it impacting what I'm going to do here, we don't want impacting the background. And so I'd rather have a little bit less activity on the actual tree here, because the changes we're going to make here are going to be very subtle anyway. And I really don't want the background to have those changes. And so let's go ahead and clean that up just a little bit. I feel pretty good about that. Go ahead and clean that up right there, up here. I think we're pretty good at this point. Now, this is going to be one where, we're going to, in the end up using a radial gradient, which I think is going to help us out a lot. But let's just go ahead and do this. I also see one patch that it missed, and so we're going to come in here and add with a brush. Let's go ahead and add here. And I think that's probably, we can add over here, I think, as well, these leaves. Be a little bit down here as well. I'm going to come back to my erase brush. There we go. And we're going to, all right, let's just go ahead and subtract with a new brush since it wants to be finicky. There we go. A little bit in here as well. And there we are. All right, now, all we want to do here is slightly add some exposure. And you can see if I start adding, it's going to look like it's glowing. So I got to be really careful here not to add too much. A little bit of warmth. Again, not a lot, because it's going to look way out of place if we add some warmth. Too much warmth, excuse me. Might pull the highlights back just a little bit, maybe a little bit of the whites, just to kind of make sure it doesn't go nuclear on us here. And let's go down and add a little bit of texture, again, to separate it from the background. Now, if we take this, can we duplicate and invert it? You can see it's going to grab everything else. And we're going to, again, be very careful to lower our exposure, lower our shadows, lower our blacks, okay? And you can see now we're starting to get some even more separation between the tree and our background. But it's not perfect. We have a lot of areas in between that are a little bit where we just weren't able to kind of discern between the tree and the background. So this is where our radial gradient is going to come in handy. We're going to make a nice big radial gradient. We'll just warm up that whole area just a smidge, and that'll kind of erase any of those areas that were kind of blotchy. The overall image here, we're going to pull the exposure down. And I'm going to do a couple things more. I really want to showcase the colors at the bottom. So let's go ahead and pull a linear gradient. And we will do that by highlighting the bottom. I am going to subtract the tree stump from this. So we're going to come to our objects and we'll go ahead and eliminate the tree stump. And that does a pretty good job. We're going to subtract the object one more time and we're going to get the rest of the tree stump here. There we go. And now we have this bottom here, which I really love. I want to add some warmth to it. I want to add a little bit of magenta. But mostly what I want to do is I want to push some of those colors. I want to really push the saturation some. See, sometimes if you add contrast, that will actually beef up the some of the colors as well. But I think we're in good shape here. Okay. Maybe that was just too much. Let's pull this back some. There we go. Sometimes it takes looking back at the entire image to realize that it's probably a little bit too much. Now, the one thing that I didn't do here, let's go to this mask. We're going to duplicate and invert it. And I'm going to bring this in, but make it longer. And we're going to create a bit of a vignette doing this. I always forget the name of that. Okay. There we go. Right. And so now, in the end, we have an image really of a tree that happens to have a kestrel up at the top. Now, what do we do with the kestrel? Well, we could come up here and say, okay, let's just go ahead and give the kestrel a little bit of a pop. And we could do that just by adding a little bit of exposure to the kestrel. There's not a whole lot we can do because he is so small up there. Turn that off, turn that on, turn that off, turn that on. You kind of get a sense. But really, he's all by himself up there. So like I said earlier, this is more of a landscape photo that happens to have a bird in it than a bird photo that happens to have landscape in it, right? And so there we are. So we have our 4 images that we worked on. We didn't really do a whole lot to the eagle image because we just want to introduce this concept of Topaz there. But we have, a really nice eagle image that we've been able to work with. Certainly our Merlin, our Harrier, and then finally the one environmental portrait, if you will, or the one shot of the environment with the kestrel up at the top of the tree. So that's how we're going to work with those images in post-processing. And as I kind of finish this episode, I want to remind you, we have 3 main points. Number 1, your post-processing begins before you leave the house. So you're thinking about, how do I want to process these images when I get back to the house later on? Make sure you collect enough assets to do that. Number 2, a light touch. You saw that I was barely moving those sliders. And if it's more about the combination of the sliders and how you work those together, and then the individual local masks that really make the big difference in our images. And then finally, make sure you execute your vision. You're not creating these images for anybody other than yourself. So make sure in the end, you create an image that you love. That's the most important thing. All right, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you liked our sort of 2-episode arc here. Last week we were out in the field. This week we're in the studio. And really appreciate you kind of coming by. If you like what you saw, I'd love a like down below. That would be fantastic. Comments are always welcome. I'd love to know how you would process these. Are there any tools that you might use that you didn't see me use that you think would be great? Please feel free to share those with the community. We all want to learn from everybody else. And have a great day, everybody. Take care.